I'm seated with an old friend, Phil Roettinger, who was a member of the CIA, in fact, played a role in the overthrow of a legally elected government of Guatemala, that of Jacobo
Arbenz.
Jacobo Arbenz.
Right, it's a little bit.
Back in 1954.
54.
Well, to go back to beginnings, you were a member of the group that did that. That
Right.
was part of American policy, wasn't it?
Of course it was. You see, the American government over the years has never permitted a popular movement in Central America. Whenever one pops up, they shoot it down. And for instance, the Guatemalans, you see, had a revolution back in 1944, where they overthrew the dictator that had been supported by the United States and let the United States do anything it wanted to in Guatemala. The United States owned, of course, the United Fruit Company was the greatest landowner and the greatest employer. And then they had the railway company, and the Railway of Central America was operated by Americans and controlled the movement in the country. And then the electric bond and share had all the power emission in the country. And the people got to the point where they just wanted to take the country back and have them own the country rather than the United States. So they overthrew the dictator, Ubico, and then they formed a new government and started out like that and began to have a series of reforms, land reform and permitted union activity that had never been permitted. They formed a cabinet for the president had a cabinet, and that never had happened before. And they went along fine there for a while, but the problem was that they had this agrarian reform plan. They confiscated all unused property that wasn't being used and compensated the owners, and of course confiscated a huge piece of ground that the United Fruit Company owned and was holding to keep somebody else from taking use of it. And they offered to compensate the United Fruit Company, but they offered the value that they carried on their tax return, which was of course ridiculous. And the United Fruit Company objected to that naturally. Well, the problem was, of course, that the United Fruit Company had two representatives, high-ranking representatives, former members of Sullivan and Cromwell, their lawyers,
Big law firm.
in the government of the United States. And one was John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, and the other was his brother, Allen Dulles, who was the director of CIA, and my boss. And so I think those two talked to President Eisenhower, not mentioning too much about the United Fruit Company, but they told Eisenhower that there was a communist government. And of course Eisenhower, being a dedicated anti-communist, said, well, it's got to go. And so he gave the job to Allen Dulles of CIA to take care of it. And this operation was one of the early ones of the CIA, of course. The CIA had already overthrown Mossadegh in Iran.
By the way, that situation in Iran with Dr. Mossadegh as president, again legally chosen. Also,
very popular man, too.
And also, by the way, he was nationalizing oil.
Yes,
and
of
was
course.
to pay the companies what they put down on their tax report.
Exactly, that's what the problem was, of course.
And there was Archie Roosevelt of the CIA.
Right, and not only that, but Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. was involved in that.
That's the father of...
Father of this guy. And, you know, when I heard this word, I'd forgotten all about that, because this happened when I was first in the CIA. And I heard this Norman Schwarzkopf, and I said, my God, I know where that name, that was the guy that participated in the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran back in 1953. And by golly, it's this fellow's father. How about that?
So there was an analogous operation here by the CIA, Middle East and Central America.
Exactly. And so this one in Central America was really completely secret, completely covert. Most of the actions from then on became known by, and nowadays the CIA can't really do anything without everybody knowing about it. But in those days the CIA was not involved, apparently not involved at all. And the United States government was not involved. It was a popular revolution, presumably. Of course it was not. We ran the whole thing ourselves and took over the government.
Now, the question is, what is it caused you to become the person you are today, to blow the whistle as you
Well,
did?
the thing
you
about,
and several other
of course, yes,
former
that's
CIA
right,
officers.
sure. Well, it was a gradual thing, Studs. I after the Guatemalan thing, I was given sort of a plum that I could choose the place I wanted to serve, and I always liked Mexico, so I asked for that, and I was assigned to the CIA station in Mexico City. And I worked there for several years, and gradually realized that nothing that I was doing, or that the CIA was doing, as far as I knew, was contributing a bit to the national security of my country. They were, on the contrary, we were causing it damage. We were getting a bad reputation. We operated in Mexico, a friendly country, and we had agents in the Mexican government. We had all these guys, and for no reason whatsoever. There was no reason for us interfering in the affairs of the Mexican government.
Why, there was a definite pattern here, wasn't there?
Of course.
When you think of the role of the CIA in Guatemala,
Mm-hmm.
and the role of the CIA in Iran,
Mm-hmm.
and in a way setting up the Shah, but ultimately set up the Ayatollah.
Of course.
In a sense, we are responsible. The role in the overthrow of Allende in Chile.
There
There seems to be a pattern here.
Yeah, it's a pattern, and they always create great problems for everybody. Nothing ever comes out any good for anybody. And for instance, the overthrow of the government of Guatemala brought on a series of repressive military dictatorships that's going on today. Even though they have a civilian president, the army is still much in control of the country. And when I got to thinking that what was happening, and that I had taken part of it, I said, look, I got to get out of this. This is not the way I want to live my life.
We know that a number of, a minority, but a number of CIA operatives, such as yourselves, have decided to blow the whistle.
Oh, yes,
Including,
yes, right.
Ralph McGahee,
Sure.
McMichael,
Oh, yeah, John Stockwell.
John Stockwell.
And a number of them.
Philip A.G.
Yeah.
And what is it that impelled you? You say you began to see.
So then I began to observe what was going on and the terrible result of the overthrow of the government of Guatemala, particularly because people were being killed routinely all over the mountains of that beautiful Indian culture was almost exterminated by these military dictators. And I thought, well, I think I have an obligation. I have an obligation to exploit my credibility as being a former officer of the CIA and having been engaged in one of these operations. And so the first thing I did, of course, was becoming interested in what happened in Nicaragua, because here we were again attacking a popular government. And so I decided to go to Nicaragua. And in 1986, I went to Managua on my own just to look around and see what was going on. And what I discovered there, I even went up in the north, up in the Contra-controlled country, and I saw the effect of a Contra attack on a farm cooperative up there. And what I saw, Studs, at that point, absolutely left me no alternative. And from then on, I decided that I've got to get into this thing and exploit my credibility, as I said, to try to get some sense into our foreign policy and alert the American people of what's been going on against them all these years with their money and without their consent. And I figured that, by golly, this CIA is really a not only an undemocratic but anti-democratic organization. It's the only one in the United States government that the people have no knowledge of. They can't tell how many people are working there. They can't tell what their budget is, and they can't tell what their programs are. And all in the name of national security, which is absolutely ridiculous, because my feeling is that national security is simply preventing an attack on the United States, the overthrow of the government of the United States or something like that. And how many times have we ever been invaded? The British did it in 1812 and it didn't work, and Pancho Villa did it out there in New Mexico and that didn't work either. So we really have almost no threat to the invasion or destruction of the United States. We were worried about the Soviet Union doing it for a long time, and of course that's disappeared. We don't have that problem anymore. But we should know what's going on in the world, of course. And the CIA was originally formed to be a collection agency of information.
And that was the OSS.
Well, the OSS was a different kind of an organization. That was
sort of the seed.
That was a military organization more than anything else, and that's good during a war. Fine,
Bill Donovan.
They did it. Yeah, they did a tremendous job during the war. But we're not at war, and my golly, you know, we just definitely should not have this organization, which, as I say, it's the only organization in our government that is really completely undemocratic. And the people have no knowledge of what's going on. They don't have any way of debating it or anything like that. And it's unconstitutional.
As you say this, your observations and reflections in Nicaragua.
Yes, exactly. That's what really got me going, because what I saw there up in the north of Nicaragua, that are financed by my money, these Contras, were killing people, torturing people, killing children. I was up there when they killed 4 little kids on this farm cooperative. And I would have liked to have President Reagan attend the funeral of those kids, because they were his people that did it. They weren't mine, they were his. I helped pay for them, but it was Mr. Reagan that did the job, I'll tell you. And so anyway, so then I went right to Washington after that. I went storming up to Washington. I hadn't been there for years, and met David McMichael there in Washington, and he suggested that I go.
He was a former CIA guy.
Of course, yes. He was an analyst at CIA, and he felt the same way I did about it. And he said, I think you ought to go up to see Charlie Clement, Dr. Charlie Clements, who was very famous for his turnaround from being an Air Force officer and becoming an anti-war and an anti-interventionist. And he had an office up on S Street, and I walked in and I said, Mr. Clements or Dr. Clements, I've just come from Nicaragua and I'm mad as hell.
And Charlie himself, by the way, went down to, after flying, after some flights over Vietnam, he quit, and he was examined by psychiatrists, because that's got to be crazy to oppose the Vietnam War.
They put him in Wilford Hall there in San Antonio.
And then he came out, studied medicine, became a doctor, helped Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, and then decided to go to El Salvador, and work among the in the
did some absolutely fantastic work there. He went in as a doctor, and the only medical equipment he had what he carried on his back, and he stayed there for a whole year in the war-torn area of Guasapa, and did a tremendous job. So he gave me space in his office, and I sat down and wrote an op-ed for the LA Times about my experiences and so forth, and that really got me started, because the LA Times published that all over the country. And so then I was, my late career was launched as an activist against war and against intervention.
Ever since Vietnam, which we got a bloody nose from little guys in black pajamas, we had to prove we could beat somebody.
That's right. That's right.
And so then there was the threat we had from the powerful government of Grenada. Of which 99% of Americans had never heard, thought it was the name of a Spanish folk song.
Well, of course.
And then we beat Grenada, by God, like Muhammad Ali licking Woody Allen.
Exactly.
And then we had to beat somebody else to overcome what we call the Vietnam Syndrome.
Oh, God, I get so tired of hearing that.
And so Panama. So why not begin?
Well, you see, we do these things to prove to the American people that they are still powerful and can do anything they want to do. And it's absolutely insane. The thing about Grenada was absolutely incredible. In the first place, there were only a few Cuban workers there, and they held up the American troops for 3 days.
And by the way, they were building, allegedly they were building a military airport, a runway. It turned out to be for tourism.
Well, of course it was. And the British were helping build it, and also the Cubans were lending some workers to build it too. But of course, we can arouse the American people so easily. We can inflame them with these things. And everybody thought, by God, we got to go in there and stop them from building this military airport and stop them from being communist and all that kind of stuff. And of course, they were getting help from Cuba. The only help we're getting from Cuba is that they had some Cuban workers over there, because they didn't have enough workers that knew what to do themselves. And these things are so upsetting. They drive you crazy. And the thing that worries me more than anything else is our government can get away with this, and the people eat it up. They think it's marvelous. a certain percentage of them. Now, a lot of them don't. And a lot of them were opposing the Gulf War here that we had, that seems to be this wonderful, wonderful thing that we did over there. And actually, we fought an untrained, unequipped army, a whole bunch of people, and that's all they were. And most of them didn't want to fight. And really, it was a pushover. And all of a sudden, we swamped the country with this horrible bombing, aerial bombing that destroyed parts of the cities, destroyed civilian buildings, and everybody cheers about this. They think it's wonderful. I can't believe it.
Well, so we come, I suppose the role of the media plays a role, rather the non-role of the media.
That's it, yeah.
So we come to, after we did arrest and overthrow a brutal man named Noriega in Panama.
Well,
That's
you know,
bit of background.
here's another thing. You see, Noriega was in our employ for a long time. We were employed by.
No, you and I paid taxes to help subsidize this guy.
You bet we did. You bet we did. and we employ scoundrels actually because they're very useful. You see, well, we also employed Saddam Hussein, but anyway, we had Noriega in our employ, and the best thing about it was, you see, that he was preventing material going to the Contras in Nicaragua, and was helping supply the Contras with equipment and so forth. And then when he turned around and decided he didn't want to do that, then we lowered the boom on him.
He was no longer our thug.
That's it, exactly. And the big problem, of course, in Panama is that General Torrijos, Omar Torrijos, was a nationalist, and he was extremely popular with the people in Panama, except the wealthy people, of course. But he was very, very popular man. Apparently, a very wonderful man.
He was the predecessor of Noriega.
That's right, and he was a nationalist. And I just don't think that we will permit any nationalist movements in Central America.
So this sounds very much like the overthrow of Jacobo
Arbenz.
Arbenz in Guatemala in 54.
Absolutely.
There's a pattern here. It's very definite.
The pattern's the same in the overthrow of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. It all works that way. No popular movement is going to succeed in Central America, and I'll guarantee you that until something radically is changed. Now, the problem, of course, is that Mr. Bush had to have some excuse for invading Panama. So they brought out these four things to protect American lives, when there had been no threat to American lives down there. In the first place, we had 15,000 troops there to protect them, and there had been no threats to American lives. They did kill this lieutenant, who it was proven that he was in a forbidden area, guarded by the Panama Defense Force, and he was armed. He shouldn't have been there to start with, and there's some evidence that he and a couple of the guys with him started some kind of a fight with the Panamanians. However, I don't know about that. But anyway, okay, so he was killed. Now, military people have to consider that it's a dangerous profession, and they're very likely to get wounded or killed at one time or another. But the idea of invading a country because one man was killed under somewhat mysterious circumstances, that was one of the reasons, and that was ridiculous. That was not the reason. So that's out. Now, the other one is to protect the Panama Canal. There was no threat to the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal had never been closed in its history until we went down there in this invasion, and then we closed it. So there really wasn't anything problem there.
I thought we were there to stop dope traffic, too.
Well, that's another thing, and we really don't much care about that, frankly, because it's going on all over the United States and everything else. And none of the reasons they gave they were all phony. The only reason that we invaded Panama, and I guarantee this is true, that we must keep that military presence in Panama. It's the largest military base outside of the United States. There's 15,000 troops there, and many, many troops go there for training, and we can control Latin America from that base. It's a lot easier than trying to control it from up in the United States. And this is something that our government insists on having, is this military base in Panama. Well, now the Panamanians have rankled under this thing for a long time. It's an invasion of their sovereignty. They don't like it, but they've had to put up with it because there was no other way around it. Now, General Torrijos, as a nationalist and a patriotic Panamanian, wanted to take his country back as the rest of the people have done in Central America one time or another. He wanted to make it a national country, and he disliked the idea of having it cut in two by this canal zone. So he, rather than engage in a military action, although he was ready to do that, as I understand it, he would have attacked the canal zone, but he talked to President Carter and convinced him of the logic and the benefit to the country of just turning the canal over to them. And this aroused a storm of protest on the right wing in the United States. We had actually just appropriated the land we took it away from Panama to build a canal, and we signed a treaty with Panama with the man who wasn't even a Panamanian. He was a Frenchman. The Bonavarilla was a Frenchman, and he just came up there and signed a treaty on behalf of Panama without them even having anything to do with it. And so we built the canal, and then can you imagine a foreign country building a canal across Florida, for instance? I mean, we would be absolutely outraged. It's a violation of our sovereignty, a violation of our territory, and that's exactly the way the Panamanians felt. But they couldn't do anything about it because they had any power at all. Now, when Torrijos came along, he began to exercise some power, and he said, "By golly, we got to do this." Well, and Jimmy Carter thought it was a really reasonable idea, and I think it is too. But they can't protect the canal. The canal has never needed any protection. Nobody's ever even thought about attacking the Panama Canal. Plus the fact that the darn thing is obsolete anyway. Our aircraft carriers can't go through it, or oil tankers can't go through it. It's just not suitable for a large ship transport anymore. And we could do without. They could close it. It wouldn't do us any harm at all. However, the Panamanians say they've been running. I mean, the Panamanian employees have been operating the thing, so there's no problem there. So the first thing we did, of course, when Mr. Reagan came into office, one of his first things was we got to re-examine the Panama Canal Treaty. So we got to do something about that. So the way they did it was to start destabilizing Panama. Now, the destabilization of Panama has been going on for several years, a number of years, where we canceled credit to Panama. We forbid our banks to deal with their banks. We did all kind of things like that, and we had a CIA, of course, operation down there. But that wasn't working fast enough. See, so Bush decided, well, we've got this Noriega now. He's down there he took over after Torrijos was killed. And Torrijos was killed, actually. We don't know exactly how, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the United States had something to do with it. Now, this is no way of proving it at this point. However, we were delighted that he was killed. I'll tell you that. I mean, our administration, because he was a nationalist. And we don't like nationalists. They're apt to close down the possibilities of our business operating freely and all that sort of thing.
And pay those businesses what they said they're worth.
Yeah. Right. So they had Noriega, and he's a good scapegoat. See, we can just say he is.
So we helped put Noriega in.
Well, sure. Incidentally, they considered him a drug trafficker. He was involved in some drug, but there's a lot of other people that were a lot more involved than he was. In fact, the people that are now in the government, that are running the government, were involved in drugs. And as a matter of fact, one of the vice presidents we installed, they weren't elected down there, this Endara and Billy Ford and the other guy whose name slips my mind. We took them into a barrack, a military barracks in the zone, and swore them in as president and vice president of Panama. They were not elected at all. And Billy Ford is one of the owners and directors of the Dadeland Bank in Florida, which is a drug laundering, money laundering and drug dealing bank in Florida. Now those guys are running the country now.
I'm talking to Phil Roettinger, Colonel Phil Roettinger, retired of the CIA and the Marine Corps. But I just merely to indicate your credentials, that you're also one of the sharpshootingest sharpshooter in the history of the Marine Corps,
Right.
and for many years I worked with the CIA and helped in the overthrow of '54 of the illegally elected government of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, and now, for some years now, you've been blowing the whistle as loud as you
I'm
possibly
trying to blow
And,
the.
we'll continue right after this.
Okay.
Phil Roettinger, ex-CIA operative. We're talking about your adventures in Guatemala and then your changing, your development, and seeing all that is cockeyed in what has been done. And speaking out on your recent visit to Panama.
Right.
And you've given the background.
Yes, the background, of course, of Panama goes way back. When we first literally stole the isthmus from Colombia and formed a new country. The people of the country had nothing to do with it, and we signed the Treaty of Hay and Buenaventura to have perpetual rights to the area of the canal zone, so that we could build the canal. And we built the canal, which is quite a feat of engineering. So we've had a number of incidents, but it finally culminated in this invasion that we've accomplished, which was an extremely ruthless military action, which has never been really divulged. The effects of it never been really divulged to the American people. And as I went down there recently to discover what I could find out about it, I discovered that Panama is in one awful shape. It's terrible shape. Now, one of the reasons we gave for invading Panama was to apprehend Manuel Noriega, because he was a drug lord. Well, Manuel Noriega was never what I would call a drug lord. He did get involved in some drug traffic, but he was never the great drug lord that we have in Colombia and in the United States, for that matter. But the problem we had with him was that he was a nationalist, just as his mentor, General Torrijos, was. They wanted to have Panama be a sovereign nation, and didn't want to have this United States influence in the country. And General Torrijos had convinced President Carter of that fact, and President Carter thought it was a very reasonable request, and that the Panamanians should have their own country back, their own land back. So they signed the Panama Canal Treaty. Of course, this was an outrage to certain elements of the United States, who thought, "Oh my God, that's our canal, we can't give it away like that." But in reality, it seems to me that there's absolutely nothing to be lost by turning the canal over to Panama. They have perfect ability to control it and to operate it.
So we invaded Panama.
So we invaded Panama. Now, as I've mentioned many times to people, that the reason we invaded Panama was that we have in Panama not only the canal in the canal zone, but we have this enormous military complex down there. We have routinely 15,000 troops stationed there, and then we have troops that go through there for training in the various training areas there. They have many military establishments in the Panama Canal Zone. And we feel that is extremely important for our control of Latin America. Now, we claimed that only, let's say, about 500 people were killed. As a matter of fact, the general in command of the operation down there said that 550 people of all types, of both military and civilians, lost their lives in that invasion. Well, there's nobody in Panama that would agree to that, because we went in the middle of the night and bombed and destroyed a large section, a poor section of Panama. Now, you know you can't do that in the middle of the night without killing a lot of people, because they were all asleep. And it was a terror-stricken night, from what I gather. I talked to many people down there, and they were just absolutely terrified of what was going on, had no idea what was going on. And they were the planes were the helicopters coming in and bombing, and of course the military barracks, the military headquarters of the Panama Defense Force, was right on the edge of this poor area of El Chorrillo, and it was completely senseless to bomb all this particular section of the city.
It was civilian area.
Civilian area, of course. The trouble is, of course, that many of the bodies of the killed were disposed of immediately by our troops, and that was one of the big things they had to do. And they bulldozed these bodies into piles and burnt them. They had mass graves where they buried them. And, you know, it's
I should point out, Phil, that you were there, and you went to this region visiting.
Oh, absolutely. And I talked to many people. Of course, as you know, I'm fluent in Spanish, so I could talk to the people very, very easily. And I interviewed people that were in that poor section and survived, but many of their families were destroyed. And it's, you know, it's a situation that's absolutely unthinkable. But that's the way we do things. And not only that, but the American people, the reaction of the American people is one of elation, of pride that we have done this. We know we have gone down there and destroyed the drug lords and all that sort of thing. And of course, now there's more drug traffic in Panama than there ever was.
So, we're talking about the celebration of Grenada and of Panama.
Yeah.
And now, of course, of Persian Gulf.
Well,
which we know the hundreds of thousands, 100,000 or so of Iranians were killed.
Course, yeah.
Retreating, by the way.
Yeah.
It now comes out they were retreating soldiers, didn't want to fight. And some of our boys called it a turkey shoot.
Yeah.
And so a sight in the shelter. So you start asking about the American.
Well, that's I'd like to raise that point, because really, you know, it seems that we are not the people that we brag about. We are not. We're very belligerent people. And we've been this way. We have to examine this, because we've been this way ever since they landed on these shores. We immediately began to exterminate the Indians, and the ones that didn't exterminate, we signed treaties that we broke, and we grabbed land. We grabbed land from Mexico. We grabbed it from, and we're a belligerent people. You know, the history of our country is fraught with all kinds of belligerent activities, even in our own country, and putting down labor strikes and that sort of thing. The big massacre of the coal mines in Colorado.
Ludlow.
Almost nobody knows about that. And we're absolutely without mercy to certain groups.
But still there are certain administrations and certain trends. We know that you knew Admiral Jean Larac.
Of course, yes.
He says we've engaged in more wars away from our shores since the end of World War II, more wars than any country in the history of warfare.
Right, and not a one of them has been declared by Congress.
The enemy, the evil empire, is no more.
That's right.
Stop the thrust of communism, whether it be Vietnam or whether it be Chile, whether it be wherever it is.
Yeah.
Since that is gone with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, pretty much, the Cold War, as we say, stone cold dead in the market.
Right.
Since that is so, we have to find other enemies.
We have to justify the military-industrial complex. And that is absolutely outrageous, because in the first place, we just signed a contract to produce a new fighter plane that's going to cost $70 billion or something like that. It's something absolutely horrendous.
But also something, I suppose, there's a diversionary aspect to it too, in that we have domestic problems, aside from the S&L.
Of course.
Highway robbery. There's a forthcoming, I'll use the word, the word you don't think about, use depression rather than recession in the air. So there's that aspect.
Something
diversionary.
Well, the American people have not yet begun to realize that we are broke.
Where does this leave us now?
It's really a sad thing. Every time something like this happens and we get involved, and then we just leave it there, you see. Now, we've done it in many countries. We left Guatemala after we destroyed their government. We just left it. That's okay, you're on your own now. And in Guatemala, there's been over 100,000 people been killed as a result of our operation. And now we go to do the same thing in Nicaragua. Now we have defeated the Sandinistas, and the country's in a disastrous situation. The rate of exchange down there is unbelievable. The Cordoba is the coin of the realm down there, and now the rate of exchange is over 3 million Cordoba per $1. So we leave these countries, we go in there, devastate them, destroy popular governments, and then leave them.
And now we've got we've got
Iraq and those places. My God, you know, it's incredible. And the thing that upsets me more than anything else, our people think it's wonderful. How can they do this?
at that moment.
At that moment. Then after a while, they get to be thinking, about the time they're getting over that, we start another one.
Yeah.
Right.
So-
I'm telling you, it's an extremely worrisome
What
thing.
do you find as you go around the country saying what you're saying?
Well, you'd be surprised how many people are agreeable to that.
Agreement to what you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm saying. And I thought by listening to the radio and watching television and seeing all these flag waving and yellow ribbons and all that stuff, but there aren't all that many people that are so happy about what we did to the Persian Gulf or to these other countries. They're not all that happy about it. I've seen many groups of people are really outraged at some of this stuff.
So what you see?
Well, there has to be an enormous change in the mentality of the American people, and I don't know how we're going to accomplish that.
Well, how is that to be changed if the media is what it is?
Well,
we
that's
get
the trouble.
Short span stuff, and we get the pom-pom boys. Hardly any
the media,
real critiques on TV.
The great percentage of the media is controlled by corporations. We know that. There are a few independent newspapers, but very few, and they don't have much influence. But the big newspapers are all controlled by corporations, and the corporations have their interests.
I'm talking to Colonel Phil Roettinger, retired, former CIA operative, a member of the Marine Corps, who played a role in what we've done was part of a pattern, overthrowing certain governments in certain countries. You played a role in the overthrow of Arbenz's legally elected government in Guatemala. That was analogous to a role, say, Archie Roosevelt played in the overthrow of Mossadegh, legally elected in Iran. And all these ultimately led to, in the case of Iran, to ultimately the Ayatollah.
Exactly.
In Guatemala, to whatever devastation there is today, putting way up on the list of violators of human rights, according to Amnesty International. What next, then? Will there be a catching on the part of the American public?
Well, you see, for one thing, Studs, that President Bush has got to keep this thing rolling. He's on what we call a roll right now. People are wildly in favor of what he's been doing, but the American people are very fickle. They can drop that immediately for some. Now, I'm concerned about what his next move would be, and my feeling is that it's very possible that the move will involve Cuba, because Cuba's been a thorn in the side of our governments for years because we don't seem to be able to do anything about it. And Fidel Castro seems to be getting along rather well. He's very popular in Cuba. I've been to Cuba a couple of times, and he's having
a rough time there, though, isn't he? There.
He's having a rough time, of course, because they have the financing from the Soviet Union has dropped off a lot. They're still helping them, but not any big amount.
You think these adventures may still keep going?
I'm almost certain that they will, because they stir up the American people and get the mind off some of the troubles they have inside of our country. And the thing is, they got to keep them going, because there's still time between now and the election where Bush's popularity might drop off.
Well, we do know that domestically things don't look too hot.
Yeah, and the thing about it is, a military adventure is a lot simpler than trying to solve some of these problems that are very difficult to solve.
Just a word about yourself.
This is very interesting. One night I was living in an apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, and my wife was off somewhere and the kids were in bed. Doc came on the door, and I opened the door, and there was a very nattily dressed young man there who looked sort of like an FBI man with a snap brim hat and one thing and another. And he said, "May I come in?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, no. I don't know who you are." "Well," he said, "I know all about you, and you've been recommended. I'd like to talk to you about a possible assignment." I was curious, so I let him in. I said, "Well, what were we talking about?" "Well," he said, "you've been recommended to our organization as having capabilities, exactly the capabilities that we need for a certain project that we have in mind." And I said, "Well, who's this we? What are we talking about?" "Well," he says, I'm not able to identify it at this point." And I said, "That's kind of peculiar." But he said, "You'll understand it after a while." And so he said, we'd like to have you we wonder if you would be interested in joining our organization. Well, I said I'd have to know a little more about the organization before I decided to join it, and also that I still have a Marine career, more or less. And he said, well, what I'd like to have you do is come down to our office and meet my superior, and he can explain it to you. And well, I said, who's your superior? Well, of course I can't identify him. So I began to think, well, this is weird. But it interested me because I'd never been up against anything like this before. So I said, well, there's no reason why I can't come down. You got to tell me where to come. So he said, well, there's a series of temporary buildings along the reflecting pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And then I began to think, I've heard something about there's some secret thing going on down there. Of course, in those days, nobody knew about the CIA. So I said, well, I'll do it. See, so you come down on Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, and I'll introduce you to my chief. So I did. I met him in front of one of the buildings that he had indicated. And we went in and passed the security, all the security business and everything. And we went in and he presented me to his chief, although nobody ever named him. He was he looked sort of like a college professor. He was dressed in a sport jacket and so forth, very, very nice and informal. And he said, yes, he said, you've been highly recommended to us as having exactly the capabilities that we need for a certain project that we have planning. And I said, well, is there any way I can find out what that is? Well, he said, not at this point, but if you do decide that you would like to come with us, then, of course, you will have everything explained to you. So I was really fascinated with the whole thing. So I said, well, I'll just tell you right now, I'll be glad to join your organization. Ah, very good, very good. Well, now, you are going to have to undergo an investigation of your background. He says, we know who you are and everything, but this is a rule, so but you'll hear from us. Well, this was in 1950. Well, I went back to, well, I was on duty in the Marine Corps, and I went back to the Marine Corps, and I didn't think any more about it, and nothing happened for a long time. And then all of a sudden, in the summer of '50, the Korean War started. So then I said, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? By this time, I had found out that it was the CIA that was recruiting me. And I said, gee, will I go to the CIA, or will I go to Korea, or what? I don't know what to do.
You joined the CIA.
I joined the CIA, and I actually went on duty in January of 1951. And then in early 1954, I was detailed to the team that went to Guatemala to overthrow the government. And as I say, it was a terribly exciting thing, terribly exciting for a young guy, and I was still a young man in those days. And it was something that you could really get your teeth into and do a good job. And we did. And the thing about it was, of course, that it was entirely secret to the American people. Now, the people down there knew exactly what we were doing, of course. And an interesting sidelight is that we were headquartered in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. We always go to Honduras when we want to do something bad in Central America because we have almost complete control over that country.
Honduras is one of our satellites.
That's right, you bet.
We talk about satellites.
So yeah, it's a satellite in effect. So we were operating there, and we hired a bunch of exiles from Guatemala and formed what now would be called a Contra force. We didn't use that but they were counter-revolutionaries, exactly what they were. And but you see, it was a different kind of thing from Nicaragua because in the first place we had what the CIA calls assets inside the government of Guatemala. We had two colonels on the staff of the president who we had subverted. We'd paid them off, and so and they had the idea that if we overthrew Árbenz, one of them would get to be president. See, and they didn't know which one. It didn't make any difference. So, and then of course we had been operating there in Tegucigalpa for some time, training these guys and getting things organized, and we got word that the Guatemalans had requested the OAS to send a team down to prove that there were Americans involved. So we got the word of that, and we had to get out of Honduras real quick. So we had a little light plane. We had a little Cessna 172, and it's supposed to be have maybe 4 passengers without luggage. But there were four of us with a lot of junk. We destroyed some of the stuff, and then we took off for Nicaragua, because we knew if we went to Managua, we'd be welcome down there. It was a little further away than we wanted to be, but it was okay. So we flew down to Managua in this little plane, and our fighter planes also flew down. And that's when I got to meet Somoza.
You met Somoza?
Had to meet, because we had to get permit to use their airfield. So I went to see Somoza, and sure, you're welcome. You do anything you want down here, you know. He was very pro-American. And so he said, I'll send you over to my son, who will give you the permit. And his son was Tachito, the latest Somoza that was finally killed. And so I went over to see Tachito, and he was an arrogant sort of a guy, but he said, oh no, my father says give you the permit, I'll give you one. It was all right with me. So he had his secretary write one, and he read it over a little bit, and then he was going to sign it. He didn't have he said, you got a pen? So I lent him the pen that my mother gave me for graduation, real fine pen, you know, and he signed it and stuck it in his pocket. And I said, Senor Somoza, my pen, and he said, no, I'll keep that. And I thought, that guy's got to go. If he's so cheap that he steals a fountain pen, that guy's he's got to go someday. And sure enough, he did. As a matter of fact, he went by bazooka down
So this is how it began. This is how recruiting takes place, doesn't it?
Yeah. So then we, of course, we got the permit to use the airfield, and our fighter planes were there. But you know, it shows an example of how things can get out of control a little bit when you're working in the field. So we did a lot of things that we weren't supposed to do, and one of which was, we had 3 fighter planes, and we only had 2 pilots. They were both Americans. One had been busted out of the Air Force, and the other one busted out of the Navy. And they were, you know, they were bad guys really, but they were good pilots. And we had other planes, we didn't have any pilot. And there was a Los Angeles American who was down there. His name was Jerry Delarme. And we had express orders not to have anything to do with this guy. He was a soldier of fortune. He would, you know, change sides if it was necessary. He'd do anything, and we weren't supposed to do anything with him. But we had another plane, and he was the only pilot we had. So we gave him another name and reported that we've hired this guy. I forget what name we gave him. Would you check him out in headquarters? Of course, they couldn't find anything out about him because it was a fictitious name. So they said, okay. Well, he was the best pilot we had. And he would do all kinds of daring things that the rest of them wouldn't do. And the funny thing is, when I got back to explain these things after the thing was over, they said, who was that great pilot you had down there? I said, come on, that was Jerry DeLong. Oh, you weren't supposed to have anything to do with him. I said, well, you just said he was the best pilot we had. So, but you know, when you're steeped in the lore of secrecy, that means you can get away with all kind of stuff.
By the way, that's the key. That's one of the keys, isn't it?
Yeah.
National security equals secrecy equals laissez-faire.
Yeah, and irresponsibility.
Equals irresponsible. Equals responsible to nobody.
Right. Another thing we did down there, we were sitting around one day, and Somoza sent a word over to us that there was a ship unloading on a Guatemalan port up there, and he says, I strongly suspect that they're delivering arms for Arbenz. So we sat there and said, well, by God, we got to do something about that. So one of the guys says, well, we ought to sink the damn ship. So we sent a guy up. We had a P-38 Lightning, you know, those twin boom planes, fighter planes. So we took one of Somoza's bombs and strapped it under the pilot's thing, with a lanyard where he could release it. And this guy flew all the way up to Guatemala and sank the ship.
Sank whose ship?
The British ship.
Sank a British ship.
It was loading grain.
My God, loading grain.
Yeah. Well, boy, that hit the fan.
What finally happened? What happened with that?
Well, we had to pay England some fantastic price for fortunately, there was nobody aboard.
Did that make the news?
I don't know whether it did or not.
I'm just trying to recall. Was that covered?
I doubt it.
That's amazing. So that's a case.
Yeah, what's
so mining the Nicaraguan harbor.
Well, that was
minor. I mean, that was more or less
but that was planned, of course.
Yeah.
But as I say, when you're involved in this kind of activity and you're way down somewhere else, away from headquarters, you do all kind of crazy things, and there's nothing they can't complain about it really. Because if you're that kind of people, that's the kind of people they want, see?
And all in the name of national
Oh,
security.
well, of course, yeah.
Well, you've given us a picture here of how one joined the CIA, why one joined it,
Right.
and this is a circle completed.
Yeah,
And that led, of course, to your work in Guatemala,
yeah.
and ultimately to your revelations.
Oh, yeah.
today. And so,
Yeah, I have never discovered anything that the CIA does that benefits the security of the United States, frankly. Now, I've been on programs where people debated, and they say, well, I said, look, in the first place, the CIA has never had an operation that didn't fall apart in some way or other, and it didn't do any good for anybody. Oh, the CIA has had several successes. And I said, well, name one of them. You need one desperately. Well, they're all classified. I said, well, sure. So all this stuff's classified.
oh, that's the other word, isn't it? The
Yeah,
word is
classified.
National security. The other word is classified.
Yeah. Our newsletter, by the way, of our organization is called Unclassified.
Unclassified. The newsletter of the ex-CIA.
Yeah.
By the way, since you mentioned that, is there a mailing address? Perhaps people would like to get a newsletter. Can they?
Yes, our office is on S Street.
Well, name the group. What is it?
It's the Association of National Security Alumni.
Mm-hmm.
And the headquarters is at 2001, I believe it is, S Street, Northwest in Washington, D.C. S is in Samuel.
Samuel. It's the Association
of National Security Alumni.
National Security Alumni.
Yeah.
It sounds like a college
Isn't
group.
that something? Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, we picked that name because
And
it's
2001,
S Street, Northwest,
S as in Sam
Yeah.
Street, Northwest.
Suite 710, I believe.
Suite 710, Washington,
Washington,
D.C.
D.C., 20006, I believe. That may be wrong. I'm not.
20006.
I think it is, yeah.
All right.
But
And if it's
we have David McMichael is the director of our office there in Washington. And he's a very, very fine guy. He's an analyst. He was a CIA analyst, and he's a fellow that was sent down to Nicaragua to document the transfer of arms from the Sandinistas to the FMLN and the rebels in El Salvador. And he went down and made a very extensive survey all the way up to the border and all around the place, and he found out that there wasn't any traffic in arms.
that sure made headlines.
Well, he came back and told Casey this, and Casey blew his stack. He said, listen, that's not what the president wants to hear. I suggest that you modify your report. And he quit right on the spot.
Yeah, he quit. But
quit.
the headline was, Sandinistas subsidize or send aid to FLN.
Yeah, and
That's
he found out that since 1981, that not a single weapon had been transferred to...
So we talk about deception
Yeah,
on a
of course.
big scale, and
Oh,
we
right.
thank you very much.
Well, you see, the
Ready.
CIA is the activities are based on deception.
Deception of the American public.
Of course. And the victims always know what's happening, and they know who's involved.
Phil Reettinger, thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.